Okay, good afternoon. Yes, I'm Keivan Stassun. What a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation. I knew that I was going to see some friendly faces that I recognized. I didn't quite expect to see so many friendly faces that I recognized. Friendly faces, period. Thank you so much. So what I'd like to do is indeed talk to you about, based on the last 20 years of my own work along with extraordinary colleagues, on developing a model for an approach to graduate education that really has broadening participation of underrepresented groups at its heart. So I'm going to be sharing with you that model, some of the learnings that have come out of that model that we believe are applicable in many other institutional contexts that hopefully will be inspiring to you as you think about innovations in graduate education. I was also asked to reflect on sort of systemic change. And so toward the end, I will share with you via my own personal journey as a change agent, which I think many of you in this room, I hope all of you in this room, regard yourselves as change agents. What are, in my experience, what are some of the ways in which we can take individual change agency, bring it to the institutional level, and then hopefully eventually affect systemic change with it? So that's what I hope to do with you today, and looking forward to sharing these reflections and then to some discussion. Okay, so I'm going to start by framing this entire conversation around the idea of belonging. And I'm borrowing this particular construct, which I really adore, from my Vanderbilt colleague, my former Vanderbilt colleague, Eric Carter, who's done a lot of work in the context specifically of disabilities communities to understand what is it from the lived experience of someone with a marginalized identity, what is it that has to be true about a space that they may wish to occupy for them to feel and believe that they fully and truly belong. And what Eric's work in that area has found is that there are essentially these sort of 10 facets to achieving full belonging, sort of in that order that you saw them appear on the wheel. That for people to feel that they truly belong, they first have to feel that they are present. You can't belong in the room if you're not in the room. You can't belong in the room if you're not invited into it and then welcomed and come to be known and heard and supported and befriended and ultimately needed and loved. And so I want to borrow from this and reframe it a little bit, since we're going to be talking about graduate education in particular and innovations in graduate education. Translate that wheel of belonging into this sort of more the kind of language that that we're using today around diversity, inclusion, and ultimately belonging. If I translate those further into sort of the mechanics of graduate education, admissions is how we decide who gets invited into the room and let in. Building community is how we help people to become welcomed and known. And mentorship, and I'll be talking about mentorship too, is how people come to be supported and heard. I'm going to leave the personal relationships out of it here so that we can really, not that that's not important, but that we can really drill down into sort of the mechanics of a model, the components of a model that are implementable. But I hope you understand where this is coming from. I mean, there's a real heart in this, and I think that's important too. So I want to step through these components and what we've learned. And I think the last thing I'll say by way of this framing is that in my experience, and based on the model that I'll be sharing with you, our experience is that where full belonging and inclusion is the ultimate goal, in my experience, my opinion, is that very often institutions maybe think that they can get at that by starting at the end and put a lot of effort and investment into thinking about and talking about and making sure that there's broad understanding about inclusion, and then maybe get to a point where they feel like, all right, we did a lot of hard work there. We've kind of understand what inclusion means and what it takes. but then kind of forget to go back to the beginning and actually invite people into the room. Okay, so that's my perspective on this, which another way of saying that is that starting with diversity is important. Okay, that's my view. All right, so let's go through these facets. All right, so let's start with admissions and talk honestly about who currently is present and invited. So I'm an astrophysicist, and so I'm going to use the field of physics and astronomy as examples here, in part because we have among, if not the poorest showing when it comes to statistics like this. And so what you see here is data from the American Physical Society, and somewhere I have a laser pointer. Showing the current representation of physics degrees, bachelor's, master's, and PhDs for different ethnic groups. And the black bar shows you, if you will, the target for representation at parity with the US population. And you see that the biggest gaps are for Hispanic and then by far for Black African American. Now, in order to not have this be a depressing story from the very beginning and all the way through, it's important to recognize over the last 20 years or so, there has been a slow and gradual but steady improvement. And I'm going to dare to take some credit for that for reasons that I show you, all of which is to say, this work that we're doing in innovations in graduate education really can, if slowly, move the needle. This is what moving the needle looks like, if only gradually, okay? But we can make we can make progress and we can make a difference, but we have a long way to go, okay? So that's admission. I'll come back to admissions, but this is the current state of affairs and sort of the challenge and the opportunity. In terms of community, what institutions are we partnering with and leaving behind when we don't partner with them? Taking physics again as the example, if you ask what are the top 10 producers of Black baccalaureate degrees in physics, all 10 of the top 10 are historically Black colleges and universities. And this list of just 20 HBCUs, Fisk is among them, are responsible for the majority, 20 schools, most of them relatively small. 20 schools are responsible for the majority of Black baccalaureate degrees in the US. And HBCUs are the top 8 and 20 of the top 50 bachelor's origin institutions of future African-American PhDs. So to what extent are we making full advantage of community in this regard in terms of the institutions that we partner with? And finally, mentorship. Another way of asking that is, what evidence do we have that we're currently successfully mentoring for our students' success, for the success of our proteges? Here I'm borrowing statistics from the Council of Graduate Schools PhD Completion Project. This is from some years ago, and so hopefully the numbers are maybe a little bit better. But nonetheless, you know, the baseline here in terms of PhD completion rate after 7 years in science and engineering. Now, this is average across the US, or large variations from one institution to the other. But this suggests that after all of the effort that we take to train and develop students through the undergraduate level, we do hard work as graduate programs to select who we think are the best, and we make some effort, I believe, in all cases to do mentoring. We have a lot of room for improvement to make sure that people are getting to the finish line, to the goal that they set out for to begin with. Okay, so that's kind of that initial framing. And so now I'm going to share with you some of the outcomes and lessons learned of the Fisk Vanderbilt Master's to PhD Bridge program. This was a program that we started between Vanderbilt and Fisk when I arrived. I was a first-year assistant professor. And one of the very reasons that I decided to accept the offer at Vanderbilt was I had this dream of building a partnership like this that would address directly some of the innovations in graduate education that were needed to make progress on some of those depressing statistics. And so the program in a nutshell partners the master's degree programs at Fisk with the corresponding PhD programs at Vanderbilt. Students are initially evaluated in a holistic manner, and I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute, selected on the basis of their promise. And then we make a commitment to them, a financial commitment to them, and a mentoring commitment to them for their success. And we did that largely in the physical sciences and some engineering disciplines. But the students come in initially for a 2-year master's degree training experience with full funding support. That gets them fully ready to transition seamlessly into the PhD program. And then they continue on to the PhD program, again, with the regular full package of funding support and with added mentoring along the way. So I told you that we started this when I was a first-year assistant professor. By the time that the first PhD graduate of that program completed, I was on the verge of getting tenure. And so I'm going to share with you a video that captures the moment when that first graduate of the fifth graduate Master PhD Bridge program finished. You're going to see some emotion in my face, and that emotion is not at all because Ebony Walker's success was ever in doubt. It was because I felt like I had finally made good on a promise that I had made to the students and to my administration and kind of to the world that this kind of approach could actually work. So let's see.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
I'm so proud of you.
Thanks.
It's emotional too for the professors.
And it's such a tremendous thrill and honor to be able now to turn to these students who we've nurtured and cared for and worried about, and to regard them now as peers. The real reward for us is to help open these doors of opportunity. So it's tremendously meaningful for us to be at this point with these incredible scholars and to send them on their way and to know that they will now lead us in tremendous discoveries.
This is the mountaintop. Who knows what's in the future, but for right now, top of the mountain.
Barb Kramer for Viewcast.
Look at my baby face. Bev knew me then. There have now been coming up on 200 students. I have to tell you, without getting overly personal, for where I started and coming into this as just kind of a dream. I mean, it really was a dream at the beginning to see these numbers. I don't lead this program anymore. It's now in very capable other hands, but it's going strong. And compared to those PhD completion rate numbers that I showed you earlier, we're doing quite a bit better. Very, very strong representation of underrepresented minorities, of women, and ultimately persistence to PhD. Along the way, Fisk has now become and maintained status as the top producer of African-American master's degrees in physics. And since 2015, Vanderbilt ranks 4th among African-American PhDs across all physical science disciplines. And number 1, this won't surprise you because of my own discipline, but number 1 among underrepresented minority PhDs in astrophysics specifically. And these students are not just surviving, but they're thriving and achieving a level of excellence and long-term engagement in the STEM enterprise and workforce that I think we would want for all of our graduates. And so I think that's really important, right? This isn't a success story by virtue of, people reach the finish line and then they kind of collapse just on the other side, but they're flying through it and then continuing to soar beyond. Okay, that was all to say that I think this is maybe something worth paying attention to. So let's come back now to these components and drill down a little bit more into each one. So let's start with admissions. And I'm going to spend a kind of a disproportionate amount of time on admissions as compared to community and mentorship, though I will talk about them too. As I said at the beginning, I think so often, it's easy to overlook this sort of key step. If the door remains locked, none of the rest of it matters. So let's talk about admissions. And I hope that you are all familiar with Julie Posselt's incredible book on inside graduate admissions, merit, diversity, and faculty gatekeeping. This is published by Harvard in 2016. Julie did essentially an ethnographic study of 10 graduate programs spanning both public and private universities. She talked to 85 people, professors, a few graduate students, spent many hours sitting in on and observing the graduate admissions process across these different programs, spanning a number of disciplines. And the questions really were, never mind what we profess to be our goals and our objectives and our implementation of graduate admissions, what does it actually look like in practice? Like, what do faculty actually do? What assumptions do they make about merit, and how does that factor in with disciplinary norms, and ultimately how does that broadening participation goals? And so essentially, I'm going to really overly distill Julie's work, but this is for our discussion today, a couple of takeaway points. What Julie found is that in most programs, there's sort of, whether this is by design or by architecture, maybe not, but in practice, this is what happens. This is how it plays out. There's sort of an initial screening and then a second rounder review. And in the initial screening is this, what you might recognize as kind of traditional, quantitative metrics-based, somewhat risk-averse look at things. And this is kind of the first triage, right? So conventional achievers of achievement, conventional markers of achievement with low perceived risk of attrition, even though, as you saw earlier, the national average PhD completion rate is like 50%. What are the important criteria? Quantitative numbers, undergraduate institution prestige, perceived rigor of the undergraduate curriculum, and then the relationship of merit and broadening participation is that the standard of merit is, at this stage, oftentimes in conflict or in tension with any broadening participation aims. Once that filter is applied, and as I'll show you in a minute, it can be a quite stringent filter, then kind of on the margins, questions of the future of the discipline, who's going to advance the future of the discipline, who's going to really bring those characteristics of leadership and transformative potential, right? Really important questions that I think most of us would recognize or believe are at the heart of graduate education. Those in practice, Julie found, come in after. Experiences and dispositions for research kind of come in later, after sort of the numbers, questions of sort of unique perspective and things like that. And then finally, diversity being looked at really explicitly in many cases, but after. So that's what has been happening in practice. And here's what it looks like for my own discipline of physics. So the American Physical Society did a survey of many, if not most, of the physics PhD programs in the country, and asked, of all the things that you could look at in an applicant's package, what are the things that you look at or pay most attention to or give most weight to? And for physics PhD programs, the answer is undergraduate grades, letters of recommendation, and sorry, I'm looking at this from an angle, and then standardized test scores. Okay, and so this is where I will make the following point. My colleague Casey Miller and I wrote this paper in Nature where we got some high-level data from ETS that just allowed us to disaggregate GRE quantitative scores for US citizens in these broad disciplinary categories. Let's look at physical sciences here, for example. And we found these powerful correlations with race, ethnicity, and also with gender. And so if, for example, you were to use a hard cutoff of GRE quantitative score of 700, as many graduate programs did and still do, you can see what that, as even just an initial filter or cut, what that would do is it essentially decimates the available pool of students in very specific demographic groups. So we suggested in this article that, you know, whether you think standardized test scores should be used at all or in what capacity, certainly using them blindly or relying on them overly has this outsized negative impact on diversity from the standpoint of who gets let in the door to begin with, right? Follow-up studies looking at this specifically for PhD completion in physics graduate programs, and now looking, for example, in addition to the GRE quantitative, but also the GRE subject test, you see there are very weak, if any, correlations between these scores across a large range of score and PhD completion. So then we asked, or if you look at that APS study, of all the things that you could look at in an applicant's package, what are the top things that you never look at? What are the things that you pay the least attention to? And you see by far, number one is the quality of an interview. And so one of the innovations that we introduced with the Fisk Vanderbilt program is to use interviews, but it's important to say it's not just interview in the sense of like, let's get to know you, or, you know, how well spoken are you? You know, do I like your personality? Do we seem to get along? No, because that would just be subject to all kinds of human biases. Rather, we drew on the large body of industrial organizational psychology literature that has found that there are what are, in my view, unfortunately referred to as non-cognitive competencies, as if there's anything that humans do that's not cognitive. But it's intended to be in distinction with constructs like GRE or SAT or standardized tests that are traditionally referred to as sort of cognitive measures. And it's been found over decades of research that these non-cognitive competencies, which can be probed and measured through an interview protocol, are highly predictive of academic and job performance in all kinds of contexts and settings. And importantly, they show little, if any, group differences. And they're orthogonal to these quote unquote cognitive constructs, meaning you can continue to use these if you want, if you use them appropriately. And this now gives you an entirely other dimension or axis to evaluate applicants along. Okay, big literature. That's just to impress you with the number of references. What we did with the Fisk Vanderbilt program was we toolified, if that's a word, this idea, and we created an interview rubric and protocol where, based on that literature, we identified 7 key components of character, of orientation, of leadership potential, of experience with working through adversity and perseverance, okay? So we didn't make up these 7 things. I mean, we wrote them down in kind of everyday language, but we didn't make them up. These are drawn straight from the literature that I showed you. And so what we started doing was, in place of some of those traditional metrics, is we invited students to talk with us and for us to ask some questions. And so here's the interview protocol. Here's some examples of questions that we would ask, or some version of them, right? Tell us about a time you faced a difficult challenge and how did you navigate it? What this is really probing is an individual's experience with and core competency with leveraging mentoring networks, understanding that effortfulness through challenge and even through failure can so often lead to long-term success. So that's really what it's probing. It's more than a get to know you. And I often am asked, well, you know, that all sounds great, Keivan, but oh my God, we get 300 applicants for a program. Are we going to do 300 interviews? No. There is a way to structure it, and we've laid this out in the toolkit that you can access from the Fisk Vanderbilt Bridge Program website. Basically, what we recommend, what we do, is that you create a list of finalists from your application pool that is about 3 times the number of your target number of admits. And think of that group of finalists in 3 categories. One you might call your sure bets in the sense of how you ordinarily, traditionally would have identified your strong applicants. That in the past, maybe you would have just immediately made them an offer. Okay, that's what I mean by sure bets. But now look intentionally for students from where hopefully you've formed some intentional partnerships and relationships, right? These days it can be tricky, if not not totally legal to be asking, where are the African-American or Hispanic students? What's absolutely legal is to ask, where are the students from institutions and schools where we have a relationship, we have a partnership, we want to make sure that we're honoring that partnership and giving a good hard look at those students because we have a relationship there. And so there again, partnerships and relationships with minority serving institutions are a really important strategy, but make sure that you're intentionally including students from that pool. And then finally, I always encourage, think of them as high risk, however what you think about that. Students where you say, you know, it looks like they might, you know, be a risk from the standpoint of completing our program, but if we could mentor them to success, that would represent a big delta for them and their career. And so then, you know, you apply this method with the structured rubric. It actually doesn't take all that long. You involve a handful of faculty. You can do it in 1 or 2 days. And then the really hard part, in my experience, is to only then make your admissions offers, trusting the holistic review that you just conducted. And in my experience, you should be prepared for a much higher yield than you ever had before, because in the process of doing this, of engaging with students in a holistic review in a way that elicits the best of themselves and where they see that that's what you're evaluating them on, they come to believe in you too. The Fisk Vanderbilt Bridge program has a yield. When we make an offer, our yield is better than 90%. Okay, so that was a lot about admissions, but let's talk about community now, and let's specifically stick to this idea of partnerships with minority serving institutions and those communities. This is a really, really important thing to understand that many of us in the business of graduate education, I think, just have never been exposed to, and so we don't understand this. Sheila Edwards Lang, some years ago, conducted a study using data from the National Survey of Earned Doctorates, I think it's called. And she looked at all 80,000 US citizen recipients of PhDs in STEM disciplines over a 5-year period. Everybody who earns a PhD in this country ends up in this database. So she had access to the full database. And then what she asked was, comparing underrepresented minorities versus their non-underrepresented minority counterparts, blue and light green here, what are the different pathways to the PhD? Everybody, all 80,000 of these people got a PhD in the end. The question was, how did they get there? And I'll just draw your attention, you know, there are various permutations. I'll draw your attention to these 2 comparisons on the far right. The rightmost comparison is what you might call the traditional path to a PhD. It's what I experienced. You earn a bachelor's degree at institution A, you forego a master's degree, or maybe it falls in your lap when you pass the qualifying exam, and then you get a PhD from another institution. That's the not equal sign. PhD from institution B. One institutional transition. And you see that underrepresented minorities are underrepresented in that traditional pathway. Underrepresented minorities are overrepresented by like 50% in the pathway that is bachelor's from institution A, oftentimes minority serving institution, master's degree, a terminal master's degree from institution B, and then a PhD from institution C. So this bridge, master's to PhD bridge, it turns out the students for decades have been kind of, you know, making that little trail through the grass just with their own feet. Essentially what we did with our program is to sort of take advantage of that pathway that the students were paving, but to wrap around them intentional structures so that they knew how to achieve and how to get to the finish line, and importantly, with real mentorship around them the whole way. So let's talk about mentorship now. And I want to start by saying that mentorship in STEM disciplines is so important that the National Academy has conducted a full consensus study on this, published in a report a couple of years ago, The Science of Effective Mentorship in STEM Medicine in addition to STEM. And ooh, they're having a party over there. And so I'll just highlight some of the findings from that report. The first is to say that there's a vast literature that proves that mentorship matters. It matters for persistence in graduate STEM programs. And in fact, there's evidence that it is the single most important factor for completing a STEM degree. That students from underrepresented groups feel better integrated into their academic communities when they experience good mentorship. There's an increased recruitment as a result for those programs that are perceived as being good mentoring environments. It enables students to see themselves, to develop identity in essence as scientists and engineers, and they're even more likely to be productive as future scholars. So mentorship matters. And we developed this, I was on this committee, and we developed this working definition of mentorship. I'll just read it to you. Mentorship is a professional working alliance in which individuals work together over time to support the personal and professional growth, development, and success of the relational partners through the provision of career and psychosocial support. What I really want to emphasize here is, well, I emphasize the word professional. This is a professional activity. Mentoring is not just, hey, we're buddies, hey, we care about one another, I'm a shoulder to cry on. It can mean that, it doesn't have to actually. Most importantly, what it is it's important to recognize that mentorship is a necessary and fundamental part of professionalization into a profession. And it is relational. It is okay, and in fact, even necessary, is one of the things that comes out in this report, for the mentor, if you will, to also be very clear about their own needs and expectations in a mentoring relationship. And in fact, the evidence is clear. The most successful mentoring relationships are ones in which both of the relational partners are clear about needs, expectations. When you do that, almost contractual, maybe compact is a better word. People are clear, and then everybody hopefully can feel like they're getting something out of it. And so along those lines, one of the things that we talk about is this idea of going beyond the traditional master apprentice, if you will, model, the dyadic model of mentoring, to one in which mentees and mentors are increasingly interconnected in networks of mentorship. And so in the report, we actually provide tools that allows mentors and mentees to develop mentoring networks and maps so that the mentee can see, for the various kinds of mentoring developmental functions, there are career functions, sponsoring, coaching, protection, exposure, challenge, role modeling, counseling, acceptance and confirmation, friendship. These are all important and necessary facets of mentoring. No one mentor can or should attempt or should believe or should trick anyone into thinking, let alone themselves, that they can or should be providing all of these functions for every one of their mentees themselves. That is a recipe for failure. Rather, be intentional about identifying that network of mentors so that mentees can see, these are the things that I need to be successful out of mentoring relationships. I'm going to get those facets of mentoring through a network of mentors. We also talk in the report about what ineffective mentoring looks like, and often it involves absenteeism or unrealistic expectations, or not having clear guidelines in that mutual relationship. And because negative mentoring experiences so often come out of, obviously it can come out of bad behavior, but you don't have to be an ill actor. You can be an otherwise well-intentioned actor, but if you don't set those clear expectations with mutuality, you can nonetheless have a bad outcome. And very often that's what happens. So mentoring is an acquired skill. And so we highlight in the report evidence-based curricula and resources for faculty, for mentors, to learn how to be better at this fundamentally important aspect of professionalization. And so here are just some pictures of it. You'll find these in the report and others. And in fact, we created, and to my knowledge, this is the first time that a National Academy's consensus study report produced an associated online guide and toolkit. So we're very proud of this, the Science of Effective Mentorship in STEM Toolkit. You can find it at www.nationalacademies.org/mentorship in STEM. Okay, and you'll find highlights from the report, that literature, that evidence basis, but very important, you'll find actions and tools where you'll find that mentor network mapping tool, examples of mentor-mentee compacts, all these different things. So I want to start to wrap up. I'm going to summarize what I see as sort of the big 4 takeaways. Think of it as the 4 M's from the main part of my presentation, and then I'm going to show you one more video to end. Sorry, I forgot to advance it here. So the 4 M's are design principles for broadening participation in graduate education. From our experience with the model that we've developed and that I shared with you, minority serving institutions are hugely important partners for diversity in science and engineering, and especially in the post-SCOTUS era, where we have to be intentional about how we pursue diversity in appropriate ways. Institutional partnerships are absolutely permitted. They've always been necessary, I would argue, but this has become more and more a vital quiver in the arrow. Master's degrees specifically can be important transition points, specifically for students from traditionally marginalized communities. The misuse of some traditional markers of achievement and potential can actively suppress diversity outcomes. If they're going to be used, they really need to be used in concert with holistic approaches, as I've argued to you. And finally, the 4th M is that mentorship matters. You should be valuing students' capacity for growth, not only their prior achievement, and being explicit about mutual expectations. So I said that I wanted to share with you this sort of my thinking about systemic change, and I want to just briefly tell it to you in the form of my own journey as an individual change agent, and now hopefully in a position to be exerting some leverage and influence at a more systemic level. So it began for me in a very localized institutional context, right? And we all operate in that context. I shared with you some of the outcomes of having built this program. What I didn't tell you is that when that student that I showed you who became the first African-American woman to lead an astrophysics paper in Nature, when that happened, the Nature editors reached out. They wanted to know about her journey, her experience, the PhD program that had enabled her success. And so they wrote up a whole article about it. That got some attention. I was asked by my chancellor in 2016 to lead a university-wide committee that ended up producing Vanderbilt's first ever diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan, in which we made some programmatic recommendations, a postdoctoral fellowship program, an undergraduate research immersion experience, which have since been implemented and institutionalized. So that's sort of kind of a brief journey in the institutional context. But then those institutional impacts positioned me to then have an opportunity, for example, with the NSF Committee on Equal Opportunities in Science and Engineering. Here you see me still baby-faced testifying before Congress, along with the incredible Shirley Malcolm. And one of the outcomes of that work was the recommendation of what became now the NSF Includes program. And then finally, this past year, I was appointed to the National Science Board. And so now in a very national context, really thinking about systemic change, what on the National Science Board, we were referring to as the missing millions, right? I mean, this is really systemic, national scale imperative for the innovations in graduate education that you all are implementing. You're dreaming them, you're devising them, you're implementing, you're doing it in institutional context. All together, this is really important for the future of the nation and for American prosperity and continued global leadership in science and technology. That was just a quick little journey in my own experience from individual actor, institutional context, national systemic impact. I'm going to end now with a bit of a twist, because as you heard in the introduction from Dr. Ortega, our very conception of diversity and inclusion is constantly changing and expanding and becoming itself more inclusive. More recently, my own work in this domain has shifted into the domain of neurodiversity. And so I'm going to show you a quick video and tell you a little bit about our efforts, including in innovations in graduate education, but in that context. Video first.
No matter where they are on the spectrum, many adults with autism have a difficult time finding a job. Even making it past our first interview can be challenging. But that may be starting to change. As we found out, more companies are discovering the potential of people with autism, and some are now actively recruiting for talent on the spectrum.
Last year, Vanderbilt University opened the Frisch Center for Autism and Innovation, a groundbreaking research center where scientists and others are developing tools and technology to transform the workplace for people on the autism spectrum.
What subject did you most enjoy in school?
They're creating computer-simulated job interviews,
straight ahead,
specially designed driving challenges, and a block design test to help a company assess a potential employee's visual problem-solving abilities.
In the model, we put things like...
Dan Berger's unique abilities caught the attention of Keivan Stassun, an astrophysics professor at Vanderbilt. His son is on the autism spectrum, and Stassun helped start the Frisch Center.
So one of the skills that you have is looking at large amounts of information?
I think my greatest skill is I see things differently from other people.
Dan may be too modest to tell you, but he is the inventor of record of this platform, and NASA has licensed it.
NASA is using Filtrograph that you invented?
Yes.
I mean, the brilliance that, Dan, that you have, that's going to become increasingly important. There's only going to be more and more data coming down the road.
And I feel like people who can understand the data, that's going to be more important.
Having a job is important to me because otherwise I would become very financially dependent on my parent, asking them, can you buy me this? Can you buy me that?
It's just been nice to be able to go home and talk to my parents about what I did during the day.
They must be very proud of you.
Yeah. They always say they're not surprised, so.
And so we've now begun to implement this work specifically in the context of, I believe, some innovative graduate education work. We have an NSF NRT program that what we call Neurodiversity Inspired Science and Engineering. More than half of the PhD students across engineering disciplines and other science disciplines in our NRT training program, we've now had more than 50 participants. More than half of them identify as neurodiverse or neurodivergent. And there's a real growing interest from companies that are very important for employment in the STEM workforce sector who are seeking out this talent. Together with colleagues at UConn and Fisk again in Northeastern University, we currently have an NSF Broadening Participation Engineering grant to, as a coalition, be thinking about how to re-architect the undergraduate experience as well as the graduate experience. And there again, you'll see holistic admissions, the importance of mentoring and training mentors, and ultimately workforce development in partnership with private sector partners, among others, to really more fully include neurodiverse students across our engineering and science disciplines and ultimately into the STEM workforce. And so with that, I'm going to leave you with a nice picture of us with Anderson Cooper, and thank you for your attention and take your questions.